The ledger hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a gunshot. Mae Harper stood across from Cornelius Finley with her chin raised, her dark eyes burning with something that could have been fury or triumph or both, and the leather-bound book between them held every secret that a powerful man had spent 3 years trying to bury. The sheriff's face had gone the color of ash. His hand moved toward the book, then stopped, as if touching it might confirm the nightmare unfolding in front of him. "That is not possible," Cornelius said, and his voice came out low, dangerous, stripped of everything except raw disbelief. "I watched that building burn. I watched the county record's office burn to the ground with my own 2 eyes, me. Every land deed, every title transfer, every contract, gone." "You watched smoke," me said quietly. "You watched flames. You did not watch me." He stared at her. The oil lamp on his desk threw long shadows across the walls of the Sweetwater jailhouse, and outside the wind was moving through the October pines with a sound like something grieving. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the desktop now, bracing himself, and she could see the exact moment the truth landed in him like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples moved across his face, shock, then awe, then something complicated and almost reverent that he clearly did not know what to do with. "You copied them," he said. "Every single one. Every deed, every transfer, every fraudulent land claim that Harlan Boyce filed in this county over the past 4 years. 93 documents. I have copies of all 93. The silence in the jailhouse was absolute. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped and a door banged in the wind. Cornelius Finley, who had ridden into Sweetwater, Colorado in the spring of 1882 as the new county sheriff, who had faced down armed outlaws and ridden through blizzards to bring men to justice, who had never in his life been rendered speechless by anything, stood speechless. And me watched him reckon with the fact that the woman he had quietly underestimated, the quiet copyist who worked in the back room of the county office for $3 a week, had just saved everything. But to understand how they got here, to understand what that ledger truly meant and what it cost, you have to go back to the beginning of that Colorado autumn, when the aspens were just starting to turn gold, and a man named Harlan Boyce was still untouchable. Sweetwater was the kind of town that had grown too fast for its own good. 6 years earlier, it had been a collection of canvas tents clustered around a promising silver vein. By 1882, it had a bank, 3 saloons, a general store, a schoolhouse, a church, a hotel, and a county records office that served 11,000 acres of surrounding ranchland. The silver had played out faster than anyone hoped, but the ranching had not, and the land itself, the rolling meadows and creek-fed valleys of the high Colorado Plateau, had become worth more than any ore ever pulled from the earth beneath it. Harlan Boyce understood that before most people did. He had come to Sweetwater in 1878 as a land speculator from Denver, well-dressed, well-spoken, and with enough legal vocabulary to confuse any clerk who sat across a desk from him. By 1882, he had acquired, through a series of transactions that looked legitimate on paper, controlling interests in nearly a third of the county's most productive grazing land. Some of it he had purchased fairly. Most of it he had not. The county records office was a single-story stone building on the main street, and it was staffed by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was pleasant enough and utterly overwhelmed by the volume of documents that passed through his office. In the spring of 1882, he had put up a notice in the general store, asking if anyone with a clear hand and a patient disposition might be willing to assist him at a rate of $3 per week. Mae Harper had taken that job, and it had changed everything. She had arrived in Sweetwater 8 months before, in the winter of 1881, on a stage from Santa Fe. She was 26 years old, she was alone, and she carried 2 bags and a rectangular wooden case that she kept close to her body, the way other people kept money. Inside the case were her tools, a set of steel-nibbed pens, 4 grades of ink, a bone folder, a magnifying glass, and a collection of reference papers so thin and precisely handled that they looked like they had been cared for by someone who understood that words on a page could outlast empires. She had learned her craft from her father, a copyist and cartographer who had spent 30 years producing legal copies of maps and documents for land offices across the Southwest. He had died of fever the previous spring, leaving me his tools and his knowledge and nothing else, because there had never been anything else. What she had was the skill itself, and the skill was extraordinary. A trained copyist in the 1880s was not simply a person with neat handwriting. The profession required an intimate understanding of document law, which copies carried legal standing, which formats were recognized by which courts, how original documents should be indexed, cross-referenced, and preserved. Me's father had taught her that a good copy was not a reproduction but a preservation, and he had taught her that preservation was a form of power, because in the end the person who held the record held the truth. Me had understood that lesson in her bones by the time she was 15. When she took the job in Gerald Pruitt's office, she did not tell him the full extent of her skills. She answered his notice, she demonstrated her handwriting, and she sat down at the secondary desk and began to work. Within a week she had reorganized the filing system. Within 2 weeks she had identified 3 documents with inconsistent notarial seals. She said nothing about the seals. She filed that information in the same careful, methodical place she filed everything, in her memory and in her personal records, and eventually, as her suspicion deepened, in the copies she began to make. Cornelius Finley arrived in Sweetwater in April of 1882, appointed by the territorial governor as county sheriff following the resignation of his predecessor, a man who had left under circumstances that no one discussed openly. Cornelius was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that showed every year he had spent working cattle ranches before he took a deputy's badge in Texas, and discovered he was better at keeping order than at punching cows. He had a square jaw and dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. He was not a talkative man. He was the kind of man who noticed things and said nothing until saying something mattered, and then said it clearly and without hesitation. He met Mae Harper on his 3rd day in Sweetwater. He had come to the county record's office to review the land deeds adjacent to his own office building. A formality, checking that the jurisdiction boundaries were properly documented, and Gerald Pruitt had shown him in, and then immediately excused himself to manage a delivery at the back. Cornelius had stood at the front counter looking at an unfamiliar filing system and wondering where to begin when a voice came from the back room, clear and dry and without particular ceremony. The boundary deeds are in the 3rd drawer from the left. The folder marked Municipal Properties 1880 to present. If you are looking at the jailhouse parcel specifically, it was resurveyed in September of last year and the new plat is clipped to the front of the original deed. He had looked up. Mae Harper stood in the doorway of the back room with a pen in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, watching him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was absolutely level. She was not small, not fragile. She was tall for a woman of the era, with dark hair pulled up in a practical knot and ink-stained fingers and an appraising quality in her eyes that made him feel, briefly and oddly, like a document being examined for authenticity. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome, Sheriff," she said, and went back to her work. He found the deed exactly where she said it would be. He stood at the counter longer than he needed to, aware that he was doing it, and left without understanding why. The town of Sweetwater was small enough that you could not avoid anyone for long. He saw her at the general store on Saturday mornings, selecting her weekly supplies with the same methodical efficiency she brought to her filing. He saw her at the Sunday service, sitting in the 4th pew on the left, singing the hymns in a clear alto that surprised him the first time he heard it. He saw her sometimes in the early morning, before the rest of the town was fully awake, walking along the creek that ran behind the main street, and she would nod to him and he would nod back, and neither of them invented conversation for the sake of it. He found himself respecting that. Most people, upon meeting the new sheriff, felt compelled to perform friendliness, to fill the silence with commentary on the weather or the price of flour or the quality of the sermon. Mae Harper did not perform anything. She simply was, in each moment, exactly what she was. It was about 6 weeks after his arrival, in early June, that he first began to suspect something was wrong in the county records. A rancher named Thomas Aldridge came to the jailhouse looking furious and frightened in equal measure. He had a piece of paper in his hand that he had received from Harlan Boyce's lawyer, a man named Drummond who operated out of the hotel's back office. The paper claimed that Aldridge had sold the eastern 40 acres of his property the previous year for a price of $220, that the transaction had been properly recorded, and that he was therefore trespassing on land that now belonged to Boyce's cattle company. Aldridge said he had never sold that land. He had never signed anything. He had never spoken to Harlan Boyce in his life. Cornelius had gone to the records office with Aldridge that same afternoon. Gerald Pruitt had produced the document in question, a deed of sale bearing what appeared to be Aldridge's signature, notarized by a man named Fellows who did operate as a notary in the county. Aldridge had looked at his supposed signature and gone pale. It was close. It was very close. But it was not right. Cornelius had looked at the document for a long time. He was not a document man. He could read and write serviceable prose, and he had no particular training in legal papers, and so he had said nothing conclusive. He had told Aldridge he would investigate. He had taken a copy of the deed, gone back to his office, and stared at it. 2 days later, he had gone back to the records office with a question he could not quite articulate. Mae was at her desk in the back room, working on the quarterly index of property transfers. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression must have communicated urgency because she set her pen down. "Can I help you with something specific, Sheriff?" He put the copy of the Aldridge deed on the desk in front of her. She looked at it for perhaps 15 seconds. Then she looked up at him, and her expression had changed, not dramatically, not with alarm, but with a careful stillness that told him she was measuring something, deciding something. "What exactly are you asking me?" she said. "I am asking whether that document is what it claims to be." The silence stretched between them. She looked at the paper again, then at him. "Why are you asking me specifically?" "Because you know every document in this office better than anyone else in this county, and because Thomas Aldridge swears he never signed that deed, and I believe him, and I need to know if I am right to believe him." She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, carefully, "The notarial stamp on that document is pressed more deeply on the left side than on the right. Franklin Fellows has a tremor in his right hand that has been getting worse over the past 2 years. When he stamps a document, he compensates by pressing harder on the left to make the impression even. This stamp is even, which means it was not pressed by Fellows." Cornelius stared at her. "You notice the pressure difference on a notarial stamp?" "I notice everything about documents," she said, without apology or modesty, simply as fact. "What else?" he said. That was the beginning of it. That was the conversation that opened the door between them, not wide, not dramatically, but enough for light to come through. Over the following weeks, carefully and privately, Mae began to share with Cornelius Finley what she had been observing for months. She had identified, she told him, at least a dozen documents in the records that showed anomalies similar to the Aldridge deed. Incorrect notarial stamps. Signatures that matched the general style of the supposed signatories but failed under close examination in specific details. Dates that appeared to have been altered. And in several cases, the presence of a transaction in the records with no corresponding original on file, which meant that the copy had been inserted into the system as a primary document, disguising the absence of anything real behind it. The pattern, she said, was consistent. The fraudulent documents all benefited a single entity, Boyce Land and Cattle, Harlan Boyce's holding company. Cornelius listened to all of this sitting across from her in the back room of the county records office, and he felt the shape of something enormous and dangerous assembling itself around him. He had known, coming into this job, that the previous sheriff's departure had not been entirely voluntary. He had suspected that something in Sweetwater was not clean. He had not anticipated the scale of what Mae was describing. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "Since February," she said. "2 months after I started working here. Why have you not said anything?" She looked at him steadily. "To whom would I have said it? The sheriff who left. The county judge who I later discovered is on Boyce's list of annual payments. Gerald Prout, who is a kind man and completely out of his depth. I had no one to bring it to, Sheriff, until you." He thought about that. He thought about her sitting in that back room for months, accumulating evidence, saying nothing, waiting for someone she could trust. "You trust me," he said. He did not mean it as a boast. He meant it as a genuine question. She considered him for a moment. "I have been watching you for 6 weeks. You returned a horse that a drunk man left tied to your railing without asking anything in return. You helped Eliza Marsh carry her groceries home when she hurt her wrist, and you did not make a performance of it. You told Gerald Prout honestly that his indexing system was confusing, and you suggested 3 specific improvements rather than simply complaining. And when Thomas Aldridge came to you with nothing but his word and a piece of paper, you believed him." She paused. "You notice things, and you do not use what you notice against people." "Yes, Sheriff, I trust you." Cornelius Finley was not a man who showed much on his face, but something showed then. She turned back to her desk before she could quite see what it was. They made a plan. It was Mae's plan, mostly, because she had been thinking about it longer, and because she understood the legal architecture of what they were dealing with in a way that he simply did not have the training to match. They would build the case carefully, document by document. They would not confront Boyce or his lawyer until they had enough evidence to make the case irrefutable. They would involve the territorial marshal's office rather than the county judge, because Mae had traced the payments in the records, and she was nearly certain the judge was compromised. And critically, she said, they needed backups of everything. Original documents, where they still existed, should be duplicated before Boyce realized what they were doing. Because a man who had gone to the trouble of manufacturing fraud at this scale would not hesitate to destroy evidence if he thought it was being used against him. "I will make the copies," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of expertise. "I have the materials and the knowledge." A proper copy, made by a trained copyist, is admissible as legal evidence in federal court under the circumstances we will document. My father argued that case before a federal magistrate in Albuquerque in 1871, and he won. Cornelius looked at her. He had spent years around people who performed competence. Mae Harper did not perform it. She simply had it, the way the mountains had elevation as a fundamental property of herself. "All right," he said. They worked through the summer. It was slow, careful, meticulous work. Mae had to continue her normal duties, the daily indexing, the filing, the quarterly reports, because any change in her routine might alert someone to what she was doing. So the copying happened in the margins of her regular hours, early mornings before Gerald arrived, evenings after he left. Sometimes she worked by candlelight until past 10 o'clock, her pen moving steadily across the paper, reproducing documents with perfect accuracy. She used a method her father had developed, a standardized notation system in the margins of each copy that documented the date of copying, the condition of the original, the location of any anomalies, and her assessment of authenticity. Each notation was dated and signed with her own initials. The system would create a chain of evidence that any competent lawyer could follow. Cornelius helped in the ways he could. He made discreet inquiries about Franklin Fellows, the notary whose stamp had been misused, and learned that Fellows had retired to Denver in January and was willing to testify about his stamping practice. He tracked down 2 of the ranchers whose land had been fraudulently transferred and obtained sworn statements from them, keeping the papers locked in his personal strongbox rather than filing them anywhere official. He also began building a quiet picture of Harlan Boyce's operations, the men he employed, the lawyers he used, the politicians he had purchased. Through all of this, Cornelius and me were talking, not just about the case, talking. It happened gradually, the way warmth comes back into a room when someone finally lights the fire. He started coming to the records office not just when he needed information, but because it was where she was. She started to tell him things beyond the documentary evidence. About her father, about Santa Fe, about the years she had spent learning a skill that most people did not understand was a skill at all. He told her things too, things he rarely said to anyone. About the Texas ranch where he had grown up, about the years of deputy work in dusty border towns, about the particular loneliness of a job that put you permanently outside the ordinary fabric of a community. One evening in late July, he came to the office at 7 o'clock to help her carry a stack of completed copies to her rooms above the millinery shop, where she kept them in a locked cedar chest. The air outside was warm and the town was quieting down for the evening, and they walked side by side through the amber light with their arms full of carefully wrapped paper. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. It came out of nowhere, or seemed to. He had been thinking about it for a while. "Sweetwater specifically, or the frontier in general," she said. "Either." She was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously the way she considered everything seriously. "My father spent his whole life moving from one place to another, following the work. I used to think I would do the same." She shifted the papers in her arms. "But then I got here and I found this and I wanted to see it through." "The case," he said. "The case," she agreed. And then quietly, "And Sweetwater, I like it here." He looked at her profile in the fading light. She was watching the road ahead, her expression calm. He felt something turn over in his chest, slow and decisive, like a key in a lock. He did not say anything. But that night he lay awake for a long time, thinking about the particular way she had said that she liked it here, and what it might mean, and what he might do about it. In August, the situation became dangerous. A new man appeared in Sweetwater, a man named Cutter, who arrived on the stage from Pueblo and checked into the hotel and did nothing obvious except watch. He was a lean, quiet man with flat eyes and the practiced ease of someone whose specific skill was intimidation. He had come, they learned through careful inquiry, from Denver, and he was in Harlan Boyce's employ. Mae noticed him on his second day. She told Cornelius that evening. "He was in the records office this afternoon," she said. "He asked Gerald to show him the index of property transfers for the past 3 years. Cornelius felt something cold move through him. "Does he know what you have been doing?" "I do not think so, not specifically, but I think Boyce knows that someone is looking at his land transactions. One of the ranchers you spoke to may have been less discreet than he should have been." He thought about her, alone in that office every morning and evening, surrounded by the evidence they had accumulated, with a man like Cutter suddenly in town. The thought was not comfortable. "I want you to be careful," he said. "I am always careful," she said. "More careful than that." She looked at him directly. "Cornelius." It was the first time she had used his given name without the preceding formality of sheriff. He registered it, felt its weight. "I have been managing this situation carefully for 7 months. I understand the danger. I also understand that the moment we panic or change our approach, we lose the advantage of looking like nothing is happening. I need a few more weeks to finish the copies. Then we send everything to the marshal's office and it is done." He held her gaze. She was right. He knew she was right, and the rightness of it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. "All right," he said. And then, because it needed to be said, "I am aware that you are the most capable person involved in this, Mae. I'm not telling you to be careful because I think you cannot manage yourself. I am telling you because losing you would be—" He stopped, looked away. "Because we cannot afford to lose the evidence." The silence was small and charged. "Yes," she said softly, "we certainly cannot." 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday night in the first week of September, the county records office burned down. Cornelius heard the bell at 2 in the morning and was out of the jailhouse in 40 seconds, running. The building was fully involved by the time he got there, an extraordinary speed of burning that told him it had been helped. He organized the bucket line with the men who had come running from their beds, and they worked for 2 hours, but it was beyond saving. By dawn, there was nothing left but scorched stone walls and a floor of ash. Gerald Prout stood in the street with his nightshirt on and his eyes wet, watching his life's work dissolve. Harlan Boyce appeared at 9 o'clock, properly dressed, and expressed his deep regret for the tragedy and offered a contribution toward rebuilding. Cornelius stood among the ruins and felt a cold and specific rage settle into him. This was not opportunistic. Someone had known what was in that building and had made a calculated decision to destroy it, which meant Boyce knew more than they had realized, which meant someone had talked, or someone had been watching me more carefully than they had understood. He went to Mae's rooms above the millinery shop. She answered the door before he knocked. She had seen him coming from the window. She was dressed alert without a trace of sleep in her face, which told him she had been awake for most of the night. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." "The records office. I know. I saw the smoke." Her eyes went past him for a moment, checking the street. Then she stepped back and let him in. Her rooms were small and orderly. The window looked out over the main street. The cedar chest was in the corner and it was padlocked. She saw him look at it. "I finished the last 18 copies 3 days ago," she said. "Everything is in there, 93 documents fully copied and notated." He turned to look at her. The full weight of what she was saying arrived in him in stages like a series of waves. She had finished. The copies were complete. The fire, catastrophic as it was, had destroyed the originals, had destroyed the evidence Boyce thought would sink them, but had not touched what Mae had spent months quietly building. "He thinks he has won," Cornelius said. "Yes," Mae said. "He does. He burned the originals." "He did, but I have the copies, and my copies are legally sufficient, more than sufficient. I have documentation of the copying process for every single document. My methodology, my credentials, the chain of custody. Taken together, it constitutes the most thorough record of fraudulent land acquisition I am aware of existing in any Colorado county." He stood in the middle of her small room and looked at her, and the feeling that moved through him was something he had no prepared word for. It was admiration at a depth he had not known he was capable of. It was something that went past respect into a kind of wonder. She had quietly, methodically, alone and without recognition, done something extraordinary. She had anticipated the worst and prepared for it, and her preparation had just made everything Harlan Boyce had done irreversible. "Me," he said. She looked at him. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that was not quite calm, a held tension, a waiting. "I need you to understand," he said, and then stopped, because what he needed her to understand was not entirely about the case. It was about her. It was about the fact that he had spent 4 months in her company and he had understood, incrementally and then all at once, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. He needed her to understand that seeing her standing there, having done what she had done, made him feel something so large he did not know how to organize it into speech. "Cornelius," she said quietly. "I am working up to something," he said. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I can see that. I am not good at this particular type of conversation. I noticed." "Me, I think I am. What I mean to say is I have been coming to that office every day for 4 months for reasons that are not all related to the case." She was very still. The morning light was coming through the window and it caught the dust motes in the air between them. "I know," she said softly. He exhaled. "You know. I have been aware for some time. I chose not to say anything because I thought you should say it first, and I knew that you would eventually." He stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, opened up, and he crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands in his, and he said, "I am not asking you to be anything except what you already are. You should know that. You are more than enough exactly as you are." Mae Harper looked up at him, and she was not a woman who was easily moved. She had learned not to be, because her life had required a kind of self-sufficiency that had gradually calcified the soft parts of her, But something about the particular directness of that statement, the particular care with which he had said it, reached past all of it. "That is a very good thing to say," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. He lifted her hands and pressed them briefly to his mouth, and she felt the warmth of it all the way up her arms. "Now," he said, not letting go of her hands, "let us go bring Harlan Boyce down." What followed was the most carefully orchestrated legal operation Sweetwater had ever seen, and most of it was engineered by me. She had already written, weeks earlier, to the territorial marshal's office in Denver, a letter that detailed the fraud she had identified and requested federal intervention. She had included a sample of her documentation methodology and a reference to the federal case her father had argued in Albuquerque, knowing that a federal marshal would need to understand why her copies carried legal weight. The response had come back 10 days ago. A deputy federal marshal named Hendricks would be in Sweetwater within the month. The fire, intended to destroy their case, had instead created the perfect moment. Boyce was confident. He believed he had erased the evidence. He had no reason to flee or make any drastic move, and that confidence would be his ruin. Hendricks arrived on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced except to Cornelius, on a stage that he took the last 100 miles to avoid attention. He was a compact, efficient man from Ohio who had been pursuing Western land fraud cases for 3 years, and when Mae laid the cedar chest's contents on the table in the jailhouse and began to walk him through her documentation system, he spent 12 silent minutes reading before he looked up with an expression of professional astonishment. "Miss Harper," he said, "where did you develop this methodology?" "My father," she said. "Combined with my own additions based on the specific legal requirements I researched for Colorado territorial courts." Hendricks looked at Cornelius. Cornelius looked back at him with an expression that said, "Yes, I know." "This is the most complete evidentiary record I have encountered in 4 years of land fraud investigation," Hendricks said. "Every document, every notation, every cross-reference. This is remarkable work." "Thank you," Mae said simply. They moved quickly after that because speed was essential. Hendricks sent telegrams to Denver under a code that Cornelius provided from the jailhouse wire. 2 additional federal marshals arrived by Sunday. The county judge, whose corruption Mae had documented through payment records, she had copied records that had also been in the county files and were now in her cedar chest, was notified that he was under federal investigation and removed from jurisdiction over the case. On a Monday morning in late September, Cornelius Finley walked into Harlan Boyce's office above the bank with federal warrants in hand and Deputy Marshal Hendricks at his side, and he arrested Harlan Boyce for land fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud, and the arson of a public building. Boyce looked at the warrants and then at Cornelius and said, with the controlled fury of a man who had been certain he had won, "Every record in this county was destroyed in that fire. You have nothing." Cornelius looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The sheriff was certain the records were destroyed, but the copyist woman had preserved them all." Boyce went very still. That was when Mae entered the room, carrying the cedar chest, and set it on his desk. She looked at him with perfect, absolute calm. 93 documents, she said. "Every fraudulent transfer you have made in this county, every forged signature, every counterfeit notarial stamp, every payment to a public official. All of it documented, copied, notated, and certified. The federal court will have it within the week." The lawyer Drummond, who had been sitting in the corner of the office, quietly and without making eye contact with anyone, stood up and left the room. Cutter, the intimidator from Denver, had already left Sweetwater the previous night, apparently having developed an instinct for when a situation was about to collapse. Boyce was held in the Sweetwater jailhouse pending transfer to Denver for federal trial. He sat in the cell and did not speak for the first day, and on the second day he asked to speak to a lawyer, and Cornelius brought him one, because that was the law, and Cornelius believed in the law even when the man in the cell did not deserve it. The federal case against Harlan Boyce took 8 months to prosecute. Mae testified in Denver for 2 days, presenting her documentation with such precision and authority that the defense attorney abandoned his attempt to challenge the copies after the first hour. Boyce was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The fraudulent land transfers were unwound by the court, and 11 ranching families recovered land they had believed lost. Thomas Aldridge, when he received the letter informing him that his eastern 40 acres were restored, drove into Sweetwater and sat in the jailhouse and cried in a way that a man of 53 had probably not cried since he was a boy. Cornelius brought him coffee and left him alone with it. In Sweetwater, in the immediate aftermath of the arrest, something happened that surprised Cornelius and should not have surprised him, but did. The town turned toward Mae Harper with a sudden and overwhelming recognition of what she had done. Word spread the way word always spread in a small town, unstoppable as creek water about the months of quiet work, the copied records, the preserved evidence. People came to her with an awkwardness that spoke of shame at their previous blindness to her. She received it graciously and without performing graciousness, which was exactly what made it credible. The county commissioners voted to formally recognize her work and to hire her as the head of the rebuilt records office at a salary of $12 a week, 4 times what she had been earning. She accepted the position on the condition that she be given authority over the filing and indexing systems, which was agreed to without argument, because at this point, no one in Sweetwater with any sense was going to argue with Mae Harper about documents. Gerald Pruitt, to his credit, was relieved. He remained in the office as the official county clerk, but was genuinely glad to have someone who understood the work far better than he did taking charge of its intellectual architecture. They developed a comfortable working arrangement built on mutual respect and a division of responsibilities that played to each person's strengths. Cornelius, through all of this, was finding his footing in a new kind of feeling. He had loved people before, family, friends, the diffuse affection of a man who was fundamentally decent. But he had not been in love before, or not like this. Not with someone who engaged his mind as directly as his heart. Not with someone whose specific excellence made him feel, paradoxically, not diminished but expanded, as if being close to her quality made room for his own. He was careful about it. He did not rush. He had told her he cared for her and she had told him she knew, and since then they had been circling, moving closer. Having dinners at the hotel's dining room on Friday evenings, which was as close to a formal courtship ritual as either of them was inclined to perform. Walking along the creek in the mornings, talking about everything. One Friday evening in October, after the Boyce arrest but before the trial, they sat across from each other in the hotel dining room and Mae put down her fork and looked at him with a directness that he had learned meant she had decided to say something important. "I was very alone when I came here," she said. He waited. "I had spent 3 years traveling with my father and then 6 months after his death traveling alone, and I was skilled at being alone. I had made a kind of peace with it." She looked at her plate and then back at him. "I did not expect to find anyone here whom I would trust. I certainly did not expect to find anyone whom I would want to be near specifically, for reasons that are not professional." His heart was doing something complicated. "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed. And then, with the particular courage of a person who does not hide from what is true, "I love you, Cornelius." I wanted to say it clearly because I think clarity is important, and I did not want to go on circling it the way we have been. He looked at her for a long moment across the table with the lamp between them and the sound of the rest of the dining room receding to a pleasant background hum, and he said, "I have been in love with you since you told me where the boundary deeds were and went back to your work without making anything of it. I just did not have the courage to say it first." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face. He had heard her laugh before, but not quite like that. Not with that particular quality of joy that came from being genuinely caught off guard by happiness. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time while the October wind moved outside and the lamp burned steadily between them. He asked her to marry him in November, in her rooms above the millinery shop, on a gray afternoon with the first snow of the season coming down outside the window. He had a ring, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Denver, because Sweetwater did not have a jeweler yet, though Mae had said there was probably a business opportunity in that, and he had planned a particular speech and lost every word of it when she opened the door and looked at him, and he understood with complete clarity that he would spend the rest of his life wanting to look at her. So he said simply, "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at his face, and she said, "Yes, absolutely yes, Cornelius," and the simplicity of it, the complete and unadorned yes, was everything. They were married in the Sweetwater church on the third Saturday in December of 1882, in a ceremony that was brief and practical, and attended by most of the town, including Thomas Aldridge, who stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and looked as though he considered this occasion a personal celebration of something larger than a wedding. Gerald Prout served as a witness, signing his name in his careful, slightly unsteady hand beside Mae's precise signature and Cornelius's bold one. It snowed that night, a real snow, and the world went white and quiet around the lit windows of Sweetwater. They spent their wedding night in the sheriff's residence, a three-room house behind the jailhouse that Cornelius had spent the past 2 months making habitable to a standard he thought Mae deserved, which meant new curtains and a proper wood stove and bookshelves, because he had paid attention to what she needed. She stood in the middle of their sitting room on their wedding night and looked at the bookshelves and said, "You built these." "I did," he said. "They are beautiful," she said, and the way she said it, softly and with her hand on the wood, told him she understood what they represented, that he had thought of her, that he had built something specifically for her, that he had imagined her life in this space and tried to make room for it. He came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there in the quiet of their first night as a married couple, and the snow came down outside, and everything that had been dangerous and frightening and urgently unresolved was finished. The records were preserved. The fraud was answered. The truth had won, quietly and meticulously, the way truth usually wins when someone is willing to do the patient work of preservation. The spring of 1883 brought changes to Sweetwater with the particular optimism that follows a hard winter. The new county records office was completed in March, built in stone and better than the one before it, with proper fireproof shelving that Mae had specified from a catalog of municipal building supplies she had studied with her characteristic thoroughness. She oversaw its construction with the same methodical attention she brought to her documentation work, and when it opened, she arranged the filing systems herself over 3 consecutive long days and pronounced herself satisfied. Cornelius watched her do this from the doorway on the 3rd day, when she was placing the final section of indexed folders onto the last shelf. She turned and found him watching her and raised an eyebrow. "You have been standing there for 20 minutes, she said. "I know." "Is there something you need?" "No," he said. "I was just looking at you." She regarded him for a moment with that level, assessing gaze that he had come to love precisely, because it never conceded a point it did not mean to concede. Then something softened in it. "Come inside, then," she said. "You can help me label the drawers." He came inside and helped her label the drawers, and their hands touched over the pen and the labels, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder in the quiet of the new office, and it was domestic and small, and he thought it was probably the happiest he had ever been. In April she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen of their house in the morning over coffee, and she said it the same way she said everything important, directly, without ceremony, with her eyes on his face watching for his response. He set his cup down. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window and it fell on her, and he looked at her for a moment that stretched out beautifully in all directions. "A baby," he said. "Yes, in October, I think. I have been counting carefully." He stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands gently with all the care he had, and she looked up at him and her expression was open in a way it rarely was, soft with something she trusted him enough to show. "Thank you," he said, which was not what he had intended to say but was true in a way that nothing more organized would have been. She laughed, that surprised laugh that he had come to love above almost all things. "You are very welcome," she said. The summer of 1883 was warm and generous, and Mae continued working at the records office through July, at which point her condition made the daily walk across town more work than she wished to admit, and she agreed. After a negotiation that Cornelius had prepared for more carefully than he had prepared for some criminal confrontations, to shift to half-days and work that she could bring home. She worked at the kitchen table in the afternoons, going through index cards and writing up her quarterly reports with the same precision she brought to everything, her belly large and her back aching in the way. She acknowledged privately to Cornelius but not publicly to anyone else, because some things were between the two of them and the rest of Sweetwater did not need to know. She was methodical about her discomfort the way she was methodical about everything. She identified what would help, she did those things. She did not complain about what remained. He brought her things without being asked and sat with her in the evenings and read to her from the newspaper or the books she had begun ordering from Denver now that there was a reliable mail route. And she leaned against his side and sometimes fell asleep, and he did not move until she woke up. Their son was born on the 1st of October, 1883. In the middle of the night with a wind off the mountains and the midwife present and Cornelius in the room because Mae had said she wanted him there, and he had not argued. The labor was long and Cornelius spent most of it trying to be useful in ways that he was increasingly uncertain were useful, and Mae spent most of it being more visibly uncomfortable than he had ever seen her, while simultaneously issuing precise instructions to the midwife that the midwife, who had been delivering babies for 20 years, seemed somewhat startled by. The baby came just before 2 in the morning, with a cry that cut through the night air like a statement. He was pink and furious and absolutely present in the way that new people are present, as if being here is the most important thing and they know it. "A boy," the midwife said. Cornelius sat on the edge of the bed and held his son and looked at Mae, who was exhausted in a way that was fundamental and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with beauty in the usual sense, and he did not have any words at all for a moment. "He looks like you," Mae said, which she would later revise to "he has your jaw," which she would further revise to "he has your stubbornness," once the baby's personality began to declare itself. They named him Edward James Finley, for Mae's father Edward and Cornelius's father James. He was called Eddie almost immediately, which neither of them had planned and which suited him entirely. Eddie grew up in the jailhouse residence and the county record's office in roughly equal measure. He learned to walk holding onto the legs of Mae's desk, and he learned to count using the numbered index tabs on the filing drawers, and by the time he was 3, he had a solemn and slightly proprietary relationship with the records office that made Gerald Prout, who was not a demonstrative man, regularly break into helpless smiles. Cornelius taught him to ride at 4, on a patient gray mare named Constance, who was entirely tolerant of small, determined riders. Mae took him with her to the records office 3 mornings a week and let him sit at a small desk she had arranged for him with paper and blunt pens, and he sat there with enormous seriousness and covered his papers with the approximate shapes of letters. The trial of Harlan Boyce concluded in June of 1883, while Mae was still pregnant. The conviction arrived by telegraph and Cornelius read it to her at the kitchen table over breakfast, and she received the news with the quiet satisfaction of someone hearing an expected and correct outcome. She had not doubted it. The evidence was too complete. Her methodology had been too sound. The 11 ranching families whose land had been recovered sent, collectively, a letter to the county that mentioned me by name and credited her work specifically. The letter was published in the Sweetwater Gazette, which had begun publication in January with a former Denver journalist who had come west for his health and stayed for the stories. Mae read it and was pleased without being effusive, and when people mentioned it to her, she thanked them and moved the conversation along because she was not particularly interested in recognition. She had done the work because the work mattered. The work had mattered. That was complete. What she was interested in was the future. Specifically, the expansion of the county record system to include a properly indexed historical archive, which she had been thinking about since her first months in Sweetwater, and which she now had the authority and resources to pursue. She wrote a proposal for the county commissioners in the spring of 1884, when Eddie was 6 months old and sleeping in the crate she had improvised into a cradle beside her desk at home, and presented it at the April meeting. The commissioners, who had by this point a sophisticated understanding of what it meant to oppose Mae Harper's professional plans, approved the proposal unanimously and allocated a budget that was almost what she had asked for, which she considered acceptable. The archive project took 2 years. It involved corresponding with land offices and government repositories across the territory, requesting original documents, establishing proper transfer protocols, and creating the most comprehensive historical record of Sweetwater County that existed anywhere. She trained 2 young women as assistant copyists, teaching them her father's methodology with additional refinements of her own, and she documented the training process so that the knowledge would not be lost. She was building something that would last, which was what she had always been doing. During those 2 years, Sweetwater itself changed. The railroad came through in 1884, which changed the economics of the region substantially. New people arrived, new businesses opened. The town grew from a rough frontier settlement toward something more established, not quite a city but aspiring, with a school that now had 2 teachers and a genuine library funded by a combination of public subscription and a donation from the county treasury. Mae contributed to the library's founding. She also contributed her expertise, helping catalog the collection and establish a loan system. She did this on top of her regular work, on the evenings when Eddie was asleep, because there was always more useful work to be done, and she had her father's incapacity for idleness. Cornelius, watching her, felt a regular and renewable sense of being married to someone larger than the ordinary category of wife. This was not a complicated feeling for him. He did not need me to be smaller than she was. He had never wanted that. He wanted exactly what he had. A partner whose intelligence engaged his own, whose specific excellence in her work matched the pride he took in his, whose company was genuinely interesting, and whose love for him was expressed not in performance but in the particular attentiveness of someone who paid real attention to the people they loved. She paid attention to him in the way she paid attention to documents, thoroughly, with an eye for what mattered, preserving the things worth keeping. In 1885 they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose, who arrived in April with considerably less drama than Eddie had and immediately demonstrated a temperament that was approximately the opposite of her brother's. Where Eddie was serious and deliberate, Clara was exuberant, loud, and apparently determined to touch everything within reach as quickly as possible. Eddie, at 2 years old, viewed his sister with the wary respect of someone who recognizes a force of nature. Cornelius adored Clara with an immediate and complete wholeness that surprised him somewhat, because he had not known until that moment that his capacity for this type of feeling could simply keep expanding, that love was not a fixed resource that divided with each new person, but something that multiplied. Mae, holding Clara in the hour after her birth, looked at Cornelius with an expression that he had come to understand was her version of complete happiness, not effusive, not performed, just fully present and entirely without guard. She reached out and took his hand with her free one, and they sat together in the morning light of their bedroom with their daughter between them, and the town outside was waking up, and everything was right. The years moved forward with the particular rhythm of a life well constructed. Cornelius served as county sheriff for another 6 years after the Boyce case, building a reputation for fair and thorough law enforcement that attracted the kind of complimentary inquiries from other counties that he deflected without much interest, because Sweetwater was where he had built his life, and he was not interested in building it somewhere else. In 1888, he was approached by a delegation of county commissioners who asked him to consider running for the position of county attorney, a role that would allow him to transition from enforcement to prosecution, and that would make use of the 6 years of legal education he had been quietly pursuing through correspondence courses in the evenings, a project Mae had known about and actively supported by ordering the relevant textbooks from Denver and quizzing him on legal principles over dinner. He had looked at her when the commissioners left, sitting across the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and the Colorado night outside, and said, "You knew they were going to ask that." "I may have had a conversation with Commissioner Walsh last month," she said with perfect composure. "You encouraged them to ask me. I suggested that your qualifications were worth considering." He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was that particular combination of exasperated and deeply fond that she had become fluent in over 6 years of marriage. "Me. You are very good at the law," she said simply. "Not just at enforcing it, at understanding it. You should use that." He ran for county attorney in 1888 and won, and the transition from sheriff to attorney was smooth, because he had spent his years of enforcement developing exactly the understanding of legal procedure that the prosecutorial role required. He was a good attorney, thorough, clear-minded, unwilling to overreach. He did not pursue cases he did not believe he could prove, and he did not pursue cases he did not believe were just, and the distinction between those two things, which most prosecutors treated as identical, was one he kept carefully separate. Mae continued her work at the records office through all of this, expanding the archive, training her assistants, developing a correspondence network with records offices across the territory that became a model for how historical documentation should be managed. In 1889, Colorado achieved statehood, and the transition of territorial records to state records was a massive archival project that the new state government contracted to experts. Mae received a formal consultation request from Denver asking her to advise on the transition methodology. She spent 3 months commuting to Denver monthly, leaving Eddie and Clara in Cornelius's care on those weeks, and when she returned from the final trip, she brought with her a formal appointment as state records consultant for Colorado, which came with both a salary supplement and, more importantly to her, the authority to set standards that would govern how records were kept across the entire state. She told Cornelius about the appointment at the kitchen table in her characteristic way, simply and directly, watching his face. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father would be very proud." She looked down at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, there were tears in her eyes, which was rare enough that he reached across and took her hands immediately. She squeezed them hard and breathed steadily and said, "Yes, I believe he would." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch of their house, a proper house now, not the jailhouse residence, a house they had bought in 1886 with its own porch, and a garden that Cornelius had planted and Mae watered with the same methodical regularity she brought to everything, and watched the stars over the Colorado plateau. She was leaning against his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and the night was warm and the insects were loud in the grass, and he said, "Are you happy?" She considered the question the way she considered every question, genuinely. "Yes," she said, "completely and specifically yes." "Good," he said, and pressed his lips to her hair. "Are you?" she said. "I think I have been happy since you told me where the boundary deeds were and went back to your work," he said. "I just needed a while to understand that." She laughed, that laugh he loved, and turned to look at him, and he kissed her in the warm Colorado night with the stars overhead and the children sleeping inside and 8 years of shared life between them, and everything was whole. Eddie, at 7, was learning to read with a ferocity that surprised even me, who had expected him to be good with letters but had not anticipated quite this level of enthusiasm. He read everything he could find, including documents from his mother's records office that she gave him when they were duplicates or had been formally retired, and he developed a particular fascination with old maps, which he would study for hours with the same focused attention that me brought to document analysis. Clara, at 4, was taking apart everything she could reach and putting most of it back together, a pattern that would eventually express itself as a talent for mechanics that neither of her parents had anticipated, but that Cornelius privately found deeply amusing, and me immediately began researching how to encourage and support. In the winter of 1890, Cornelius brought a case against a mining company that had been illegally dumping waste into the creek that fed the valley's water supply. It was not a glamorous case, and it was not easy. The mining company had resources and lawyers from Denver, and the kind of institutional confidence that came from expecting frontier courts to defer to money. Cornelius prosecuted it with the same methodical thoroughness that he had learned, in no small part from watching me work, and he won. The company was fined and required to remediate the creek, and the families who depended on that water were not required to give up a right that was theirs. Thomas Aldridge, now retired and living with his daughter's family, sent a letter when he heard the verdict. He had sent occasional letters over the years, maintaining a gratitude that was genuine and lasting. In this one he said that Sweetwater was a better county than it had any right to be, and he attributed it to people who cared about what was right more than what was easy. Me kept the letter in the cedar chest that she had kept since before the fire, the same chest in which she had preserved the 93 documents that brought down Harlan Boyce. The chest held other things now: Eddie's first drawings, Clara's first shoes, their marriage certificate, the letter from her father that she had been carrying since his death, a pressed columbine from the creek path. Documents and objects that told the story of a life built carefully and preserved with love. On a Saturday morning in the spring of 1891, Cornelius came into the kitchen to find me at the table with the cedar chest open, going through its contents with the particular care she had always brought to old documents. Eddie was at school. Clara was in the backyard with the enthusiasm of a child who had discovered earthworms. The house was quiet and the spring sun was coming through the window, and me looked up when he came in. "I found something," she said. He sat down. She was holding a piece of paper he recognized, a letter her father had written to her in the last year of his life. He had not read it, it was hers, but he knew she took it out and read it sometimes. "He wrote," she said, "that the most important thing about preserving a document is understanding what it meant to the person who made it. Not just what it says, what it meant." She looked at the paper and then at him. "I have been thinking about that." "What have you been thinking?" he said. "That I want to write something about the methodology. About all of it, not just the technical process, but the purpose of it. Why it matters to preserve records, what it means for ordinary people when their documents are kept honestly and well. I think," she paused, and he recognized the pause of someone assembling a thought they cared deeply about. "I think there are women and men across this state who are doing what I do without any training, without any framework, and who are making it up as they go because no one has ever written it down for them. I want to write it down." He looked at her. "A book, a manual perhaps, or a book, something serious." "Of course you do," he said, and his voice was warm with the particular warmth of a man who has been paying attention for 9 years. She wrote it. It took 2 years, working in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons, with the occasional Sunday morning when Cornelius took the children to church specifically so that she had 3 hours of uninterrupted work. The Manual on Records Preservation and Document Authentication was completed in 1893 and submitted to a publisher in Denver who specialized in professional reference texts. It was accepted and published and distributed to county records offices, territorial archives, and law schools across the western states. The dedication read, "To my father, Edward Harper, who taught me that the person who holds the record holds the truth, and to my husband, Cornelius Finley, who believed that before he had any reason to." Cornelius read the dedication alone in his office on the afternoon the first printed copies arrived, and he sat very still for a long moment. And when Mae came home that evening, he was waiting on the porch with the book in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had never seen before, completely unguarded, completely open, the face of a man who has been reached in a place he normally keeps private. She came up the porch steps and stood in front of him, and he said, "Mae," and she said, "I know," and she took his face in her hands and kissed him once clearly, and then leaned her forehead against his. They stood like that in the evening light of their porch in Sweetwater, Colorado, in the spring of 1893, with their children's voices coming from inside the house and the mountain air moving around them and 10 years of a built life between them, and it was everything, and it was whole. Eddie grew up and became a surveyor, which was perhaps inevitable given the childhood hours spent over maps, and he worked across the Colorado Plateau documenting land that had never been properly mapped, carrying with him a notebook system his mother had designed for fieldwork documentation that was borrowed from her father's original methodology and improved upon significantly. He was precise and patient and stubborn, and he wrote his mother letters from the field that contained detailed observations writ in a hand that was clearly her son's and clearly hers. Clara grew up and became a mechanical engineer, which was not inevitable but was perhaps predictable to anyone who had been paying attention, and she went to college in Denver at a time when this was still unusual for women, and she was not troubled by the unusualness, because she had grown up in a house where her mother's expertise was simply a fact of life, where a woman's knowledge was treated as the foundation of a community rather than a curiosity. Cornelius served as county attorney until 1895 and then retired from public office, setting up a private legal practice that he operated at a pace determined by himself, which was moderate, because at 50 years old he had discovered that he had earned the right to be selective about how he spent his time. He spent a great deal of it with me. They walked the creek path in the mornings, which they had done since the early months of their knowing each other, and the walking was different now, slower, easier, full of the conversation of people who have nothing to prove to each other and everything still to say. They walked the same path where he had seen her in the early mornings when they were new to each other, before he knew her, before he understood what she was, and sometimes he looked at the creek and thought about that time with a kind of tenderness for who he had been then, a man who had not yet understood what was in front of him. He told her that once, on a September morning when the aspens were turning again, and the air had the clarity of altitude and altitude season, and they were standing by the creek where it bent around the old cottonwood. "I think about when we were new," he said, "how I used to see you here in the mornings and not know what to say. You said good morning," she said, very reliably. That was the extent of my conversation. It was sufficient, she said, and smiled, and it was the smile that had undone him on 100 different occasions, unguarded and warm and entirely herself. He took her hand where they stood by the creek, and they walked on together through the aspens, and the light came through the turning leaves in coins of gold, and the Colorado morning was wide and clear around them, and the whole of their life was ahead of them still, most of it already lived, all of it worth keeping. The cedar chest lived in their bedroom now, on the shelf below the window, where the morning light fell on it first. Mae still opened it sometimes, not for any professional reason but for the reason anyone keeps a chest of important things, to confirm that they are still there, still real, still preserved. The 93 copies were still in it, though their legal work had been complete for a decade. They were history now. The record of what had happened, kept by the woman who understood better than anyone in this county that records matter, that preservation is care, that the truth needs someone willing to hold it when powerful men try to burn it down. Sweetwater had a new county records office, fireproof and properly staffed. It had a library and a school and 2 churches and a railroad depot, and a population that had grown to nearly 3,000 people. It had, in the town archive that Mae had built, a complete historical record going back to its first year of incorporation, documented with a thoroughness that researchers from Denver occasionally came to study. And it had, on the main street beside the records office, a small brass plaque that the county commissioners had placed in 1890, which read, "In recognition of Mae Harper Finley, whose preservation of county records in 1882 exposed widespread fraud and restored 11 families to their rightful lands." Mae had expressed her opinion of the plaque by pointing out that the lettering was not quite level, and the commissioners had had it adjusted, and she had pronounced it acceptable, and then she had gone back to work. Cornelius had stood on the sidewalk after the placement ceremony and looked at the plaque for a long time alone, and felt the full weight of all of it, the fire, the cedar chest, the morning she had put the ledger on his desk and told him what she had done, the look on her face when she had done it, certain and clear and without apology. He had been so sure the records were destroyed. He had watched the building burn and believed, for one terrible morning, that everything was gone. He had underestimated for the last time in his life what Mae Harper was capable of. He had never underestimated her again. He had also never stopped being grateful in the particular way that changes you, that she had been there, that she had been exactly who she was, that he had been paying enough attention to notice. The morning light in Sweetwater, Colorado fell on the brass plaque and the records office and the creek and the aspens and the mountains beyond, and it fell on the house behind the old jailhouse where 2 children had grown up and left, and where a man and a woman were sitting on the porch together in the early October air, drinking coffee, watching the town they had helped build go about its morning. Mae had a document on her lap, a draft proposal for an expanded state archive that she was helping to design, and she was reading it with the focused attention she brought to everything written, making small notes in the margin with her pen, her handwriting as precise and clear as it had been 40 years ago when she sat in her father's study learning how to hold a nib against paper. Cornelius was watching her and not pretending otherwise. She looked up. "What?" "Nothing," he said. She regarded him with the steady gaze that had appraised him on their first meeting, and that still, after all these years, contained its original quality of honest assessment. "You are looking at me with that expression again," she said. "What expression?" "The one that means you are thinking something." "I am always thinking something. About me specifically." He smiled, the slow, deliberate smile that she had spent years coming to love. "I was thinking," he said, "that you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. I was thinking that I have been aware of this for a very long time and I never quite stopped being aware of it." She looked at him for a moment. The mountain morning air moved around them. A wagon went by on the main street, and somewhere in town a school bell rang. "I was also thinking," he said, "that I would like to read your draft when you are finished, if you will let me." She looked back at her paper and made another careful note, and the small curve at the corner of her mouth was there and then was gone, but he caught it. "Yes," she said, "I will let you. You always catch the errors I have stopped seeing." He stretched his legs out and picked up his coffee, and they sat in the morning together, and the aspens on the mountain were turning gold, and the record of everything they had built was there in the town around them, preserved and complete and lasting. Because Mae Harper had understood something before almost anyone else did, that the most important things are the ones worth keeping. That preservation is itself an act of love. That to hold a record against the forces that would destroy it is to insist on the truth, and to insist on the truth is to protect every ordinary person who depends on it. She had done that first for strangers, and it had changed a county. She had done it for herself, in the careful and patient preservation of her own hard-won life. And she had done it for the man beside her on the porch, in the particular way she had always loved him, thoroughly, attentively, with the document of everything they were together kept safe in the cedar chest on the bedroom shelf and in her memory, which was the most reliable archive she had ever known. The mountains rose behind Sweetwater, and the morning continued, and everything, at last and completely, was as it should be.